The place is Assaye, a place few now remember, yet a place where the entire trajectory of the British Empire, perhaps even the future of the Napoleonic Wars, was determined in a single, impossible morning. Imagine the dawn. It is September 23rd. The air is thick with the monsoon's humidity, not yet dispelled by the brutal Indian sun. A thin, nervous fog clings to the Kaitna River, a natural, serpentine barrier running through the endless, parched plains of the Deccan. You are standing with a handful of men, barely 7,000 soldiers, only 1,500 of them British Redcoats, the rest being vital, but untested, Allied infantry and cavalry. Your commander is Colonel Arthur Wellesley, a man whose name, at this point in history, means very little. And what you see across that narrow, sluggish river is not an army. It is a continent. It is a military behemoth stretching as far as the eye can possibly see, a dark, churning line of steel and muscle that swallows the horizon. This is the main force of the Maratha Confederacy, one of the last great indigenous powers of India, and it is a terrifying, modern machine. The intelligence reports were horrifying, yet true. They estimated the Maratha force at nearly 50,000 soldiers. We can now revise that historical figure to a more accurate, yet still crushing, 30,000 to 40,000 men. But look closely at the numbers that truly mattered that morning. Wellesley had perhaps 7,000 effectives in total. The Marathas' primary combat force included over 10,000 elite, French-trained infantry, drilled to European precision, backed by perhaps 20,000 heavy cavalry, ready to turn any British tactical error into a massacre. But the most chilling sight was their artillery. Not the paltry, small field guns the British had hauled across the subcontinent. No. This was an armada of cannons. Over 100 heavy guns, many of them cast in European foundries, positioned to utterly dominate the battlefield. They were a wall of fire waiting to be unleashed, ready to tear apart any formation fool enough to cross the river. The mathematical reality of this confrontation was simple, brutal, and inescapable: 7,000 against 40,000. This was not a battle where victory was improbable. This was a position where survival was literally impossible. Had Wellesley obeyed every standing military doctrine, every conventional law of war, he would have done the only logical thing: sounded a desperate retreat, abandoned his baggage, and fled for his life. A commander faced with this disparity is not asked to win. He is asked to minimize the inevitable, catastrophic defeat. The British Empire, at this stage in history, was not yet the sprawling, unstoppable superpower of Victorian legend. It was a fragile, desperate enterprise, constantly teetering on the brink of financial and military collapse, sustained primarily by the ambition of the East India Company. And the company knew that if its small expeditionary force under Wellesley was crushed, if those 1,500 Redcoats were annihilated, the Maratha cavalry would flood the Deccan, sweep south, and ignite a rebellion across every British-held territory. It would be the end. The final, humiliating expulsion. The day Britain lost India before it had truly begun to claim it. Wellesley, however, was not known for doing the logical thing. He had spent his entire career in India forging a tactical code that was considered suicidal by his European peers. His officers stared at the colossal enemy lines, looked back at their thin, tired columns, and whispered the question that hung in the humid air: has the general gone mad? The great, unspoken, forgotten truth of Assaye is that Arthur Wellesley did not fight to win a battle. He fought because he could not afford to wait. He was forced into a desperate gamble, a blindingly fast, audacious attack against a numerically superior foe entrenched on perfect defensive terrain, because the consequences of delaying the fight were far more terrifying than the slaughter that lay ahead. This was a calculated, career-ending risk designed to force the issue, to shatter the enemy's momentum, and to avert the total global catastrophe that was already unfolding in Europe. The Battle of Assaye would not just decide the fate of India, it would secure the financial and military lifeline that would allow Britain to survive the coming storm of the Napoleonic Empire. The order was given. the small column began to move. They were marching into history, but more importantly, they were marching toward a day that, by every law of war, should have been a massacre. A day that should have seen the sun set on the British presence in the east. To understand why a small skirmish in an obscure corner of India mattered, we must pull back the lens from the dusty plains of Assaye and fix our gaze on the European continent. Because the desperate gamble taken by Arthur Wellesley on that morning was not about securing a provincial trading post, it was about global survival. The year 1803 was not a moment of peace. It was the eye of a hurricane. The uneasy truce that followed the Treaty of Amiens was already fraying, and by the spring of that year, Britain and France were once again locked in a struggle for world dominance. And leading the French charge was the most formidable figure Europe had seen in a millennium, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was not merely a military commander, he was an engine of geopolitical change, bent on absolute control. His ultimate target was always Britain, the nation of shopkeepers and ships that stood defiant against his land-based empire. But Napoleon understood a fundamental truth. Britain's ability to resist him was not rooted in the muddy fields of Flanders or the rocky coasts of Spain. It was rooted in gold. Specifically, the immense, endless flow of wealth derived from the Indian subcontinent. The British East India Company was not just a trading entity. It was, by 1803, the single largest financial contributor to the British war effort against France. The textiles, the spices, the opium, the raw capital, all of it translated directly into the naval ships, the armaments, and the subsidies paid to European allies, like Austria and Russia, necessary to keep the continental powers fighting Bonaparte. India was the financial heart of the anti-Napoleonic coalition. If that heart stopped beating, the coalition would collapse, leaving Britain isolated and vulnerable to invasion. Napoleon knew this. His entire strategy, stretching back to his Egyptian campaign, was to attack Britain's interests in the East. He didn't need to conquer India himself, he simply needed to empower a native force strong enough to expel the British. This is where the Maratha Confederacy becomes critical. The Marathas were not just a tribal levi or a regional kingdom. They were the most potent military power remaining in India, organized into a sophisticated, quasi-feudal empire. Crucially, their forces were not merely equipped by the French, they were trained and led by them. French officers, veterans of European campaigns, such as General Michel Péron, commanded large, well-paid, professional brigades of Maratha infantry. These were not the ragtag forces the British had previously faced. These were counter-European regiments operating on Indian soil, using identical drilling and tactics to the troops that were currently sweeping across Europe. They possessed modern muskets and, most terrifyingly, the heavy, mobile artillery that the British military had historically used to dominate native forces. The Maratha Confederacy, therefore, became Napoleon's great eastern proxy. A massive, decisive Maratha victory, the kind of victory that would be assured if Wellesley had retreated from Assaye, would have sent shockwaves across the globe. It would have triggered the instant collapse of British power in India, drying up the essential flow of wealth. The moment that gold stopped arriving in London, the ability of Prime Minister William Pitt to finance the long, drawn-out global struggle against Napoleon would have vanished. It is no exaggeration to say that if Wellesley's small force had been obliterated at Assaye, if the Maratha army had swept forward into the Deccan, the balance of power in Europe would have tipped irreversibly in Napoleon's favor. The field of Assaye was not just a battlefield in India, it was the invisible front of the Napoleonic Wars. It was a 7,000-man British lifeline being defended against a French-backed continental force, determining whether Britain would have the resources to even fight at Trafalgar or fund the Peninsular War years later. For Arthur Wellesley, standing on the banks of the Kaitna River, the fight was personal. But for history, the stakes were global: lose this battle, and Napoleon wins the world. The Maratha Confederacy, standing arrayed before Wellesley at Assaye, was not just a military force, it was the armed guard of a colossal, sprawling empire that encompassed the richest tracts of the Indian subcontinent. To the British East India Company, these lands, Hindustan, were not merely territory, They were the ultimate prize, a source of wealth so staggering it could fundamentally alter the balance of global power. For decades, the Marathas had skillfully played various European powers against one another while extracting tribute from vast areas of central and western India. Their treasury, built on the taxation of millions, contained fortunes that made the wealth of many European kingdoms seem provincial. The control of this region meant guaranteed access to the world's most sought-after commodities: the fine silks and muslins, the indigo dyes, the saltpeter essential for gunpowder, and the specie, gold and silver bullion, that poured into their coffers. This was the source of the company's obsession and the fuel for Napoleon's ambition. The Maratha wealth was not static, it was highly mobilized. It allowed the Confederacy to maintain that massive, modern army seen at Assaye, complete with French mercenaries and top-tier artillery. Unlike the decentralized forces of earlier Indian rulers, the Maratha military machine was a cash-funded, professional entity. This financial strength created an existential threat to the British. The problem for the British wasn't just losing the potential riches, it was losing the established economic engine. The presence of the Marathas in the Deccan acted as a colossal, non-negotiable roadblock to the company's strategic vision, a continuous, controlled commercial corridor across India. Every town, every trade route, every tax collected by the Marathas was a resource denied to the British war effort against France. More critically, the Marathas' power represented a psychological and political flashpoint. Their success inspired resistance. If the British forces were seen to be decisively beaten, the myriad minor rulers and principalities currently bound by treaty to the East India Company would instantly defect. A single, crushing defeat at Assaye would have triggered a cascade of rebellions, turning the British foothold, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, into besieged, isolated outposts. Imagine the news arriving in London: Wellesley's army annihilated. Maratha cavalry sweeps the plains. Native states rise up in revolt. The British credit market would seize up. The subsidies to Austrian and Prussian armies would dry up. The entire global strategy of containment against Napoleon would crumble into dust. The Maratha Confederacy wasn't just fighting for their sovereignty. They were fighting, indirectly, for Napoleon's triumph. They were the key to unlocking the riches that would finance French dominance. The stakes, therefore, transcended the mere cost of the campaign. They were about the total, irrevocable ruin of Britain's global position. To secure India was to secure the financial wellspring that would eventually allow Britain to buy the coalitions and the time needed to defeat Napoleon years later. Conversely, a British loss would not just be a defeat, it would be the greatest financial and political disaster in the history of the burgeoning empire, one from which it might never recover. The 1,500 Redcoats at Assaye were standing between the East India Company and oblivion, between Britain and financial ruin, and between the world and a Napoleonic dictatorship. That dusty field was literally where the British global financial future was staked. The desperation felt by Colonel Wellesley on the morning of Assaye was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of years of humiliation, strategic incompetence, and costly defeats that had defined the British military experience in India up to that point. The Redcoats stood before the Maratha behemoth not as confident masters, but as men keenly aware of a recent, painful history of failure. The grand narrative the British wished to project was one of unstoppable superiority. The reality, however, was far messier. The campaigns against earlier powers, such as Mysore, though ultimately victorious, were characterized by agonizingly slow progress, massive logistical blunders, and moments of near catastrophe. British commanders often underestimated the tactical adaptability and sheer courage of the indigenous armies, viewing them through a lens of European bias that proved deadly. Crucially, the conflict with the Marathas had been preceded by a string of diplomatic and military fiascos. The First Anglo-Maratha War, 1775–1782, ended not in triumph, but in a stalemate solidified by the Treaty of Salbai. This treaty was, for the British, a tacit admission that the Marathas were too strong to defeat outright. This failure stood as a permanent scar on the company's reputation, proving that the Maratha Confederacy was the only power capable of successfully resisting British expansion. The very campaign leading up to Assaye was riddled with strategic anxiety. Prior to Wellesley taking command, the company's forces had demonstrated a dangerous lack of speed and decisive action. There was a prevalent mindset of caution and logistical paralysis, a fear of being drawn too far from secure bases, a fear of the monsoon, and a fear of confronting the overwhelming Maratha cavalry in open country. This hesitation had ceded the initiative to the enemy, allowing the Maratha commanders to maneuver freely and consolidate their massive army. The consequence of this prior incompetence was a shattered morale and a heightened sense of professional shame among the officer corps. The commanders serving under Wellesley had internalized the idea that fighting the Marathas meant fighting an endless, expensive war of attrition, a war they were unlikely to win decisively. Their fear was rational. Previous engagements had taught them that the Indian sun and the enemy's numbers were far more lethal than any European foe they had encountered. This history of failure explains the extreme caution urged upon Wellesley on September 23. The officers urging retreat were not cowards. They were realists, haunted by the memory of previous blunders that had cost thousands of British and Sepoy lives. Wellesley himself understood the weight of this accumulated failure. He knew that the Marathas, emboldened by European training and decades of successful resistance, were anticipating the usual British indecision. They expected a slow, methodical approach, allowing them time to select the perfect defensive ground. It was against this backdrop of strategic failure, crippling caution, and recent humiliation that Arthur Wellesley had to make his decision. His subsequent actions were not just an act of tactical genius, they were a radical rejection of the humiliating, slow, and ultimately self-defeating British military traditions that had brought them to the brink of ruin in India. He understood that to repeat the mistakes of the past, to retreat, to delay, to wait, was to guarantee the annihilation that the Marathas were expecting. We now transition from the global stakes to the central figure of this drama, the man tasked with preventing the annihilation of the British project in India, Colonel Arthur Wellesley. The history books remember him as the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, the victor of Waterloo, the man who felled Napoleon. But on the dusty banks of the Kytna River in 1803, he was none of those things. He was a young, often overlooked, and generally unimpressive colonel, whose greatest claim to fame was the shadow cast by his far more powerful elder brother, Richard Wellesley, the Governor-General of India. The narrative of his life up to this point is not one of destined genius, but of mediocrity and social engineering. Born into the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, the young Arthur was initially deemed the least promising of the Wellesley boys. His early education was unremarkable. His mother famously called him food for powder, essentially meaning he was good for nothing but being a soldier. This low expectation haunted him. He purchased his first commission, as was the custom, and rose through the ranks rapidly, but only through the immense political patronage exerted by his family. His early military career was marked by solid, yet utterly uninspired, service. The defining early moment of his professional life was one of unmitigated disaster and public embarrassment, the Flanders Campaign, 1793 to 1795. Serving in the Duke of York's disastrous expedition against the French revolutionary forces, the young Wellesley was a witness to, and minor participant in, a humiliation of the British Army. The campaign was a shambolic retreat through the icy, logistical nightmare of the Low Countries. Wellesley saw firsthand the catastrophic failure that results from poor planning, incompetent command, and a lack of decisive action. This defeat, though often forgotten in the shadow of Waterloo, was his crucible. Unlike other officers who blamed the weather or the Allies, Wellesley absorbed the painful lessons. He realized that the British system was rife with amateurism. He developed a quiet, intense obsession with the most mundane but crucial aspects of warfare, logistics, supply, and administration. While others were dreaming of grand tactics, Arthur was learning how many bullocks it took to move a heavy gun, and how to reliably feed 5,000 men in hostile territory. This focus on the unglamorous groundwork was seen by his peers as pedestrian, even dull, the work of a clerk, not a dashing officer. When he arrived in India in 1797, it was due entirely to his brother, Richard, who required a loyal and competent commander he could trust in the field. To the wider military establishment, Arthur was nothing more than the Governor-General's little brother, a beneficiary of nepotism who was likely too inexperienced to handle the complex, unique challenges of the Indian theatre. They scornfully referred to him and his command as the Sepoy General, a derogatory term implying he was only fit to command native troops in a colonial backwater, far from the real fighting in Europe. This dismissal fueled a quiet, burning ambition. In India, Wellesley was finally free from the constraints and gossip of the London officer clubs. He could implement his unconventional, deeply analytical approach to warfare. He transformed himself from the awkward, uninspired subaltern into a relentless, detail-oriented commander. He saw the British Army's prevailing arrogance, the belief that European tactics alone could defeat Indian forces, as a fatal flaw. He dedicated himself to understanding the enemy's strengths, the speed of the Maratha cavalry, the discipline of the French-trained infantry, and the political landscape. He was unconventional, studying Indian customs, languages, and even topography with an intensity few other British commanders ever bothered with. By the time he rode into the Deccan campaign, Arthur Wellesley was still the underestimated colonel, but he was equipped with a meticulous preparation and a tactical philosophy forged in the fires of personal humiliation and logistical realism. He was the man who was supposed to fail, the man sent to the remote war to serve his famous brother. But in reality, he was the only man capable of facing the impossible odds ahead, precisely because he had mastered the very things his flashier contemporaries disdained. Arthur Wellesley's reputation as an unassuming, almost dull officer masked a relentless, analytical mind hardened by campaigns that most British commanders would prefer to forget. His true education, the lessons that would lead to his audacious decision at Assaye, were not learned in the grand training grounds of Europe, but forged in the scorching heat and humiliating setbacks of the Indian backwater. The most crucial of these early trials was the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War in 1799. This was not a grand triumph for Wellesley, but a masterclass in logistics and command. Following the British victory and the death of Sultan Tipu, Wellesley was appointed governor of Seringapatam. His task was not military conquest, but civil administration and pacification, a role he performed with meticulous, almost obsessive, efficiency. This period, often overlooked, was absolutely vital. It was here that he internalized a fundamental lesson. Warfare in India is 90% logistics and 10% fighting. In the European theatre, supply lines were relatively short and infrastructure existed. In the Deccan, roads were non-existent, local populations were often hostile, and a lack of forage meant an army could starve itself to death waiting for a battle. Wellesley spent countless hours mastering the intricacies of local procurement, organizing bullock trains, establishing secure depots, and learning to pay his troops and local suppliers on time and in correct specie. He famously declared that the great secret of war is to know what you can legitimately expect your troops to do. He learned that logistical failure was the quickest route to defeat, far more certain than an enemy charge. This intense focus on administrative perfection allowed him to later march his men at a pace that was considered impossible by his peers, the very speed that allowed him to surprise the Marathas at Assaye. Following Mysore, Wellesley was plunged into the messy, frustrating operations against the bandit king Dhandu Wog. This campaign, full of grueling pursuits and elusive targets across treacherous terrain, taught Wellesley another enduring principle, the necessity of decisive aggression. Dhandu Wog consistently evaded the lumbering British columns, frustrating commanders who were trained only for set-piece battles. Wellesley, however, pursued Dhandu with a relentless, almost personal intensity, living off the land, covering immense distances, and ultimately cornering and destroying the enemy force. The scars from this campaign were twofold: physical exhaustion and strategic enlightenment. Firstly, Wellesley experienced firsthand the physical limits of his men. He learned the exact threshold of heat, hunger, and fatigue his sepoys and redcoats could endure before discipline broke. This intimate knowledge of his troops' capacity allowed him to demand the almost superhuman effort required to reach Assaye. Secondly, he realized that caution was the enemy of victory in the Indian theatre. If you hesitate, the Maratha cavalry, or any indigenous light force, will melt away, only to reappear in your rear, attacking your supply lines. The only way to win was to force the issue, relentlessly pursue, compel the enemy to fight on your terms, and strike before they had time to consolidate. His peers viewed this as reckless, a dangerous deviation from standard doctrine. Wellesley viewed it as the only viable path to survival. These forgotten campaigns, pacification in Mysore and the relentless pursuit of Don du Wog, were the foundational stones of the general who stood at Assaye. They instilled in him a unique blend of meticulous administration and audacious speed. He was no longer just the Governor-General's brother. He was a commander who understood the reality of war in India, ready to stake his career and the fate of the British project on the very unconventional lessons learned in the subcontinent's forgotten backwaters. Arthur Wellesley's tactical approach, the system he deployed at Assaye, was not merely unconventional, it was a heresy against the established military doctrine of the era. He deliberately discarded the cumbersome, cautious playbook favored by European generals and instead embraced a philosophy that can be summed up simply as, go fast, go light, and force the fight. This doctrine was viewed by his peers as reckless, dangerous, and outright suicidal. The standard British and European military doctrine of the time emphasized methodical advancement, robust supply chains protected by massive escorts, and a primary objective to seek out terrain favorable for a decisive, set-piece battle. Speed was sacrificed for security. This conservatism was fatal in India. Wellesley realized that against the massive, fluid forces of the Marathas, particularly their overwhelming light cavalry, this cautious approach guaranteed defeat by attrition. The Marathas would simply avoid battle, harass the supply lines, and starve the invading army into submission or retreat, as they had done many times before. Wellesley's suicidal doctrine flipped this on its head. Wellesley's troops moved at a pace that shattered the expectations of both the enemy and his own allies. While other columns moved at a snail's pace, constantly waiting for straggling baggage and heavy siege trains, Wellesley streamlined his logistical structure to the bare minimum. He insisted on logistical self-reliance. His troops carried exactly what they needed and nothing more. The constant, brutal training he enforced was designed to condition the troops, both British and Sepoy, to cover immense distances in scorching heat, without fail. He prioritized mobility over firepower, understanding that catching the enemy was half the battle. His forced marches across the Deccan were a physical trial that should have demoralized his men, but instead, they forged a unit that believed itself capable of the impossible. The core of his tactical heresy was his belief in compelling battle. Most commanders sought to engage on advantageous ground. Wellesley sought to engage the enemy whenever and wherever he found them, regardless of the numerical or positional disadvantage. This aggressive posture was calculated. He knew the vast Maratha army, for all its size and French training, relied on two key factors: numerical confidence and defensive entrenchment. By moving with terrifying speed, Wellesley denied them the luxury of choosing their ground and preparing their perfect defense. He aimed to shock the enemy into deployment, catching them in the middle of a maneuver or forcing them to fight when they were psychologically unprepared. This was the ultimate gamble, intentionally engaging with an unfavorable disparity in forces, betting that his troops' superior discipline, speed of maneuver, and his own ability to seize an immediate tactical opportunity would overcome the Marathas' crushing numerical advantage. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his plan involved his own small cavalry force. Against the tens of thousands of Maratha horsemen, Wellesley still deployed his limited, precious cavalry aggressively, not as a defensive screen, but as an offensive spearhead. He planned to use them to exploit any single crack in the enemy's massive line, to disrupt their formations, and, if necessary, to sacrifice them to buy time for the infantry to complete its maneuver. He recognized that the Marathas respected speed and audacity above all. A cautious British general was a general that could be defeated. A mad British general, one who attacked when logic dictated retreat, was one who could shatter their morale. Wellesley's doctrine was not a system for minimizing loss, it was a system for maximizing psychological impact. It demanded absolute confidence in his subordinates, iron discipline from the troops, and a willingness to stare down astronomical odds. It was the only way a small, financially strapped expeditionary force could hope to defeat an entire continental army backed by the riches of Hindustan. At Assaye, Wellesley was about to execute this suicidal doctrine, with the fate of British India resting on its success. To fully grasp the magnitude of Wellesley's gamble at Assaye, we must move beyond simple numbers and truly appreciate the sheer military sophistication of the enemy he faced. The Maratha Confederacy was not a collection of feudal levies or disorganized tribesmen. It was an enemy masterpiece, a military structure that had successfully blended indigenous power with the absolute cutting edge of contemporary French military science. This was the terrifying result of decades of strategic investment and, critically, the wholesale employment of European mercenaries. The backbone, French-trained infantry. The core of the Maratha power lay not in their legendary cavalry, but in their disciplined, salaried infantry brigades. These formations, often commanded by European adventurers like General Michel Péron or Monsieur Pullman, were the equal of any on the continent. The Maratha army at Assaye fielded roughly 10,000 to 12,000 elite infantry, disciplined troops paid better and more consistently than many in the British East India Company's service. They were drilled à la Française, adopting the precise firing and maneuvering sequences that had made Napoleon's armies so formidable. Their muskets were often of superior quality, supplied via French and Portuguese trade networks. They fought in solid, multi-rank formations, utilizing the fearsome rolling volley fire that the British relied upon. Wellesley was not facing a disorganized horde, he was facing a mirror image of himself, a European-style army, but one that outnumbered his own by at least 4-1 in the infantry line. This was the first, and most dangerous, element of the threat. The hammer, the Maratha cavalry. Supplementing this elite infantry was the renowned Maratha cavalry, the traditional arm of the Confederacy. Numbering nearly 20,000 horsemen, this force was divided into professional heavy sowars, horsemen, and the swift, terrifying light cavalry, the Pindaris. Their primary strength was harassment, encirclement, and shock. They were masters of the Ganamikava, the lightning raid or guerrilla attack, capable of appearing suddenly, stripping an enemy's supply line, and vanishing before they could be brought to battle. At Assaye, their role was clear. Once Wellesley's tiny infantry line broke, which they fully expected it would, the cavalry would charge into the rupture, turning a defeat into a total massacre and pursuing the remnants of the company's force to the last man. The pressure their presence exerted on Wellesley's flanks was immense, forcing him to keep his already thin line stretched to the breaking point. The decisive factor, artillery supremacy. But the true source of Maratha power, the element that most terrified British command, was their artillery. While the British possessed maybe a dozen light, 6-pounder guns, the Marathas deployed over 100 pieces of heavy, well-cast ordnance. These included huge brass 24-pounders and howitzers, mounted on mobile carriages. This was absolute fire superiority. Under the direction of their French technicians, the Maratha gunners were highly trained and their positions along the Kaitna River were perfectly sighted. They were designed not just to destroy British formations, but to pulverize them before they could even reach the line. Every foot of the river crossing, every yard of the open plain that Wellesley's troops would traverse, was zeroed in. The heavy artillery could tear massive, irreparable gaps in the thin British ranks, and once those gaps appeared, the French-trained infantry would advance and the cavalry would envelop the flanks. This artillery superiority fundamentally changed the dynamic of the battle. It negated the traditional British advantage of disciplined volley fire, because a formation that has been hammered by heavy cannon fire for 30 minutes cannot hold its cohesion long enough to execute an effective volley. In short, Arthur Wellesley faced a force that was numerically overwhelming, 5-1, technologically superior, heavy artillery, tactically equivalent, French-trained infantry, strategically dominant, command of the terrain and local resources. Assaye was designed to be the definitive demonstration of this enemy masterpiece. The Maratha commanders were confident they had lured the impetuous British commander into a perfect killing field, a defensive position behind a river barrier, protected by an impenetrable curtain of cannon fire, backed by disciplined infantry, and flanked by an ocean of cavalry. For Wellesley, attacking this fortress was not a display of courage, It was an act of profound desperation, confronting the single most advanced and formidable indigenous military power the British had encountered in their entire history of expansion. The confrontation at Assaye was not a planned engagement. It was the inevitable, brutal collision resulting from Arthur Wellesley's relentless, high-stakes gamble, the deadly pursuit. For weeks leading up to September 23, Wellesley's small, mobile column had been engaged in a punishing, forced march across the punishing terrain of the Deccan. This was a race against two implacable enemies, the Maratha army and the Indian monsoon. The Maratha strategy was classic and clever: delay and exhaust. Knowing their main advantage lay in their overwhelming numbers and their ability to draw the British into difficult terrain where logistics would fail, they deliberately maneuvered to avoid a set-piece battle. They aimed to drag Wellesley's column further and further from his supply bases, hoping the monsoon rains would turn the roads to impassable mud and that exhaustion would break the discipline of his forces. Wellesley, however, countered this with the go fast, go light heresy. He drove his troops, the 19th Light Dragoons, the 74th and 78th Highlanders, and the vital Sepoy battalions, at a relentless pace that bordered on the cruel. The intensity of this pursuit was designed not just to follow the enemy, but to terrify them with sheer speed. The commander risked mutiny, sickness, and total collapse, but he knew time was the Maratha's greatest ally. Every day he delayed was a day they used to consolidate their alliance, gather more troops, and reinforce their position. The monsoon season added a layer of profound difficulty. The rains had begun, turning river crossings into treacherous torrents and the dusty trails into energy-sapping quagmires. The logistical nightmares Wellesley had trained so meticulously to overcome were manifesting daily: carts stuck in the mud, bullocks dying from overwork, and disease threatening to decimate the ranks before a single shot was fired. But the real peril of the pursuit was the Maratha light cavalry. The Pindaris were everywhere. They didn't engage in large-scale combat. They operated as a harassing cloud, riding ahead to poison wells, burning fields, and constantly testing the British flanks and rear. Every halt meant an increased risk of a raid. Every mile gained was paid for in nervous energy and the constant, draining vigilance required to protect the meager supply train. Wellesley's determination became the central force holding the column together. He personally oversaw the logistical details, ensured the men were fed, and enforced a brutal training regime even while on the march, ensuring that discipline, the one true advantage the British possessed, did not erode under the strain. He understood that his troops were at their physical breaking point, but also that they were on the edge of tactical victory. By September 22, Wellesley's column had covered an impossible distance. The exhaustion was palpable, but they had successfully driven the Maratha army into a corner near the small village of Assaye. The forced march had achieved its purpose. It had compelled the enemy to stop running. The stage was now set. The pursuit had been a desperate, near-suicidal race against time, but it delivered Wellesley exactly what he needed: a stationary, consolidated enemy force. However, the price of this speed was that he had arrived with an exhausted, undersized force, far from help, standing directly before a behemoth that was fully rested, strategically positioned, and ready to unleash its torrent of cannon fire. The pursuit had delivered Colonel Wellesley to the Kaitna River, but the information that guided his final approach was tragically flawed. This chapter is about the horrifying moment of realization, the point where the strategic situation went from difficult to utterly impossible. Wellesley, relying on local intelligence, believed he had found only the Maratha cavalry screen and their heavy baggage train near the village of Assaye. The expectation was a sharp skirmish to capture supplies, or at most, a battle against a strong, but containable, rearguard. He anticipated a relatively straightforward engagement against perhaps 10,000 troops, preparing for a fighting retreat. As his exhausted column crested the final ridge overlooking the Kaitna River valley around noon, the blood drained from the faces of the British command. The sight before them was a vision of hell. It was not a skirmish line. It was not a rearguard. It was the entire, colossal Maratha army, the enemy masterpiece, in a state of perfect battle readiness. The Marathas, under the command of Scindia and Raghuji Bansal, had chosen their ground with ruthless precision. Their lines stretched for over 3 miles, anchored between the Kaitna River in the north and its smaller tributary, the Jua, in the south. The Kaitna River, which Wellesley thought would provide a flank protection, instead formed a perfect defensive barrier. The terrain was flat, open, and ideal for their vast cavalry force and, critically, their heavy artillery. This was not an army caught by surprise. This was an army waiting in a perfectly prepared trap. The strategic miscalculation was immense. Wellesley had pushed his army to the physical limit for weeks based on the idea that he could force a fragmented enemy to fight. Instead, he had succeeded only in delivering his tiny, depleted force directly into the jaws of a consolidated, overwhelming Leviathan. His initial plan, a simple attack on a maneuvering column, was instantly rendered null. Wellesley's subcommanders, primarily Colonel Stevenson, who commanded the second column, still miles behind, would have been horrified. The conventional, logical response was shouted aloud by his advisers: immediate retreat. To attempt an attack now, across a river, against a 5-to-1 advantage with artillery superiority, was not merely folly, it was an abandonment of command responsibility. A frontal assault, the only apparent option, would see the 1,500 Redcoats pulverized by the cannonade before they ever came within musket range. The atmosphere must have been one of absolute dread. The weary British and Sepoy troops, who had marched for weeks believing they were chasing a dispersed enemy, now stared at a defensive line so vast and well-armed it seemed to mock their very existence. Every man in that column knew they were trapped. Their rapid pursuit had led them not to victory, but to the precipice of total annihilation. This moment, where the fatal miscalculation became horribly clear, is the true beginning of the battle. It forced Arthur Wellesley to abandon every plan, every established expectation, and rely solely on his iron will and the unorthodox, reckless tactical philosophy he had forged in the backwaters of India. He had walked into the trap, and now, against all military logic, he had less than an hour to find a way out that didn't end in a collective graveyard. The sheer, staggering sight of the consolidated Maratha army forced an immediate, impromptu council of war on the banks of the Kaitna River. The moment the scale of the enemy was revealed, the 40,000 troops, the 100 guns, the perfect defensive terrain, every instinct and every established military tenet screamed a single, desperate command: retreat. Wellesley's most senior officers, hardened veterans all, strongly urged an immediate, controlled withdrawal. Their counsel was sound, rational, and entirely supported by the horrific numbers. A frontal attack was suicide. A retreat, while humiliating and a temporary setback, would at least preserve the core of the British Army, allowing them to fight another day after Colonel Stevenson's slower-moving column could join them. The arguments were compelling. Sir, we are walking into a perfect killing field. The artillery alone will annihilate our line before we close within effective range. We must wait for Stevenson. We must preserve the army. But Arthur Wellesley saw something his officers, focused on the immediate tactical danger, missed: the strategic disaster of delay. This was the moment of truth, the single, career-defining decision that separated the competent commander from the forgotten genius. Wellesley knew that retreating was not a neutral act, it was a guaranteed catastrophic defeat. The impossibility of delay. The Maratha army was massive, but it was also a fluid political entity, a coalition of powerful chiefs like Scindia and Bonsall. Their power relied on momentum and prestige. If Wellesley retreated, even a short distance, the Marathas would instantly regain the initiative they had lost during the deadly pursuit. They would interpret the British withdrawal not as a sensible tactical move, but as fear. This would lead to an immediate, strategic chain reaction. Maratha confidence unleashed, the Maratha forces, already arrogant due to their superior numbers, would be instantly energized. Their vast cavalry would pursue the retreating British, turning a controlled withdrawal into a messy, disastrous rout. Allied defection. The Sepoy regiments and Allied Indian cavalry in Wellesley's own column were watching their European commanders closely. A retreat would be perceived as a loss of will, shattering their already strained confidence. Defections would begin immediately, turning Wellesley's army into a fragmented, unreliable mob. The Deccan ablaze, news of the British retreat would spread like wildfire across the subcontinent. Every minor ruler currently sitting on the fence would recognize the moment of British weakness and join the Maratha cause. The entire Deccan region would erupt in rebellion, making further campaigning impossible. Wellesley saw clearly, to retreat now was to forfeit the campaign, to lose India, and to guarantee that the wealth needed to fight Napoleon would never reach London. The strategic cost of delaying the fight outweighed the terrifying tactical cost of engaging immediately. The audacity of the attack. Therefore, Wellesley made the only choice that could save the campaign, a choice rooted in his suicidal doctrine: attack, immediately and decisively. His order, delivered with characteristic cold detachment, was simple: no, we shall attack at once. He was betting everything on two core assumptions. First, that his men's discipline, forged in the relentless pursuit, was superior to anything the Marathas possessed. And second, that the Marathas, despite their numbers, were psychologically dependent on the notion that the British would never dare to attack such a fortress. He was aiming to shatter their entire war model with a single, incomprehensible act of audacity. He realized the direct frontal assault, the only one visible to the Marathas, was indeed suicide. The only way to succeed was to find a hidden, exploitable weakness that the enemy had ignored in their arrogance. With the clock ticking and his officers paralyzed by dread, Wellesley mounted his horse and began to personally reconnoiter the Kaitna River line. He was no longer a cautious colonel, he was a commander staking his entire career, and the destiny of an empire, on the slenderest thread of possibility. This decision, made under the greatest pressure, transformed the overlooked Arthur Wellesley into the Iron Duke. It was the moment he defied professional opinion, military doctrine, and common sense, choosing impossible risk over certain strategic ruin. The fate of global commerce and the fight against Napoleon now rested on finding a flaw in the perfect Maratha trap. Faced with certain tactical ruin from a frontal assault, Arthur Wellesley mounted his horse, not to flee, but to search for the impossible. He began a frantic personal reconnaissance, riding along the bank of the Kaitna River, observing the vast, confident Maratha lines. His officers watched, convinced he was surveying the field of his own annihilation. The Maratha commanders, arrogant in their numerical and positional superiority, had made a critical, almost arrogant oversight. They believed the Kaitna River, with its steep banks and swift current, protected their entire front. They focused their deadly artillery almost entirely on the direct approaches and the high ground, confident that the river was an insurmountable barrier. But Wellesley, driven by his meticulous understanding of terrain honed in the Deccan campaigns, was not looking for the obvious. He was looking for the flaw in the masterpiece. Riding near the small village of Pepalgan, located just to the right of the Maratha left flank, Wellesley's relentless observation paid off. He spotted what appeared to be a small cluster of villages crossing the river. There, hidden from the main Maratha view and ignored by their artillery crews, was an unseen ford. It was a shallow, narrow, and forgotten crossing point, a single, vulnerable seam in the enemy's seemingly impenetrable defense. This discovery was the single most pivotal moment of the entire battle. It instantly transformed the strategic picture from impossible defeat to audacious opportunity. Wellesley immediately halted his reconnaissance and issued the new, astonishing order. He would not retreat, and he would not launch a frontal suicide charge. Instead, he would execute a stunning, high-risk maneuver that defied all logic. He would lead his entire, tiny column, including every man, gun, and horse, in a single, exposed column across that hidden ford, swinging around the Maratha left flank. This was a move of supreme, almost breathtaking audacity. To cross the ford meant exposing his entire force to attack while they were most vulnerable, stretched out in a single, slow line, unable to form up or deploy their scant artillery. If the Marathas had spotted the maneuver and reacted quickly, moving their massive cavalry force to the ford, Wellesley's column would have been sliced to ribbons during the crossing. But Wellesley calculated that the Maratha high command was too arrogant, too fixated on the frontal trap they had laid, to believe such a reckless maneuver was even possible. He was betting on their contempt for the British. The crossing began. It was a moment of grinding tension. The British and Sepoy troops, though utterly exhausted and unnerved by the proximity of the massive enemy, obeyed the order with rigid discipline. The column began to snake its way across the shallows. As the column emerged on the other side, the Maratha command finally realized the catastrophic nature of the British maneuver. The Maratha commanders were initially stunned, then plunged into a panic. Wellesley had turned their perfect defensive terrain, the river, into a strategic liability. He was now positioned on their open flank, where their massed artillery, which was designed to fire forward, was largely useless. The Maratha army, that giant, beautiful war machine, had to execute a clumsy, desperate maneuver, a left wheel, to face the new British threat. This movement was time-consuming, organizationally difficult, and, critically, disrupted the perfect firing pattern of their heavy guns. Wellesley had not just found a path across the river, he had, through a singular stroke of observation and audacity, destroyed the enemy's battle plan before a single musket had been fired, transforming a defensive masterpiece into a logistical nightmare for the Marathas. The impossible flank was secured. The slaughter was about to begin. The discovery of the unseen ford was an act of tactical genius, but the execution of the crossing was an ordeal of unimaginable terror, the moment of maximum vulnerability. This was the crossing of Assaye, where the small British and Sepoy column was plunged directly into artillery's hell. As Wellesley's troops began their slow, painstaking transit across the shallow ford near Pipalgan, they exposed themselves completely. Stretched out in a single, vulnerable line, unable to deploy or return effective fire, they became a perfect, unmoving target. This was the moment the Maratha command, now fully aware of the flanking maneuver, frantically tried to salvage their position by bringing their massive artillery superiority to bear. The Maratha gunners, though dislocated by the unexpected move, were quick to react. While many of their heavy guns were fixed in place, the more mobile pieces were rapidly hauled and resighted. The moment the British column reached the middle of the river, the cannonade began. It was a sound of sheer, overwhelming destruction. The roar of over 100 guns, heavy 24-pounders and howitzers, shattered the tense silence of the plain. The air filled with the terrifying scream of cannonballs, grapeshot, and chainshot ripping through the ranks. Unlike musketry, which can wound, heavy artillery fire does not simply injure, it obliterates. Imagine the scene: the exhausted troops, already stretched thin, were trapped in the riverbed. The water erupted in plumes of spray and mud as solid shot plowed through the ranks. Men were not just falling, they were being pulverized, their bodies torn apart by the weight of the metal. Gaps the size of small carts opened instantaneously in the column. Every second spent in the river was a gamble against absolute annihilation. The discipline displayed by the Sepoy battalions, particularly the Madras Native Infantry, and the British regiments was extraordinary. This was not a moment for heroics, it was a moment for mechanical, rigid obedience in the face of certain death. They could not return fire, they could only continue to move, to place one foot in front of the other, marching into the deafening, smoke-choked tempest of metal. Wellesley himself was at the head of the column, personally directing the crossing. His presence was vital, a cold, rigid anchor against the terror and confusion. He knew a single moment of panic, a single unit breaking rank and attempting to flee, would cause a cascade, turning the crossing into a catastrophic rout. The troops had to trust that the speed of the maneuver would get them out of the kill zone before the artillery could completely dismantle their force. The primary British units, including the 74th and 78th Highlanders, suffered the heaviest casualties here, but their discipline held. They marched forward, stepping over the grotesque ruins of their fallen comrades, their collective will forcing them through the torrent of fire. Crucially, the sheer speed of Wellesley's maneuver, combined with the structural rigidity of the Maratha artillery deployment, saved the column. The enemy simply could not reposition all their guns quickly enough. Only a fraction of the full Maratha firepower was brought to bear, but that fraction was still enough to inflict devastating, irreparable losses. As the column finally emerged on the north bank of the Kaitna, they were a ghost of their former strength, shaken and diminished, but intact. They had crossed the river, the essential barrier, and survived the artillery barrage. They had paid an exorbitant price, but the unthinkable had been achieved. Wellesley now had his troops on the enemy's side of the river, forcing the entire Maratha army to execute a desperate wheeling maneuver to face him. The crossing of Assaye, an operation that should have resulted in total destruction, had instead secured the impossible flank and delivered the tiny British force to the edge of the killing ground, ready to deploy for the coming clash. The greatest danger was past, but the brutal main event was only just beginning. Wellesley's troops, having staggered out of the Kaitna River under a torrent of cannon fire, were now faced with the second, equally terrifying challenge, deploying for battle against an enemy line that seemed to extend into infinity. Every conventional rule of 18th-century warfare dictated a cautious, four-rank-deep formation to ensure solidity and firepower. But facing a force that outnumbered him 5-1, Wellesley knew that to follow doctrine was madness, and to deploy madness was the only chance for victory. As the Marathas frantically attempted their left wheel to face the unexpected threat, a maneuver that caused considerable confusion and delay in their vast, complex ranks, Wellesley ordered his troops to form an impossibly thin battle line. He deployed his entire infantry force, including the precious British regiments, the 74th and 78th Highlanders, and the disciplined Sepoy battalions, into only 2 ranks deep. This was an act of extreme desperation. A 2-rank line doubled the frontage his small force could cover, making his line appear longer and more formidable than it was, but it also made it dangerously fragile. Such a thin line was highly susceptible to breakthrough by any concentrated Maratha cavalry charge or sustained infantry pressure. Every single soldier was exposed, and there was absolutely no reserve to plug a gap. The entire line was stretched to the absolute breaking point. To further compound this tactical risk, Wellesley deployed his small force into a refused flank formation. Recognizing that his numbers were too few to cover the entire ground, he anchored his right flank on the village of Assaye and deliberately refused, or bent back, his left flank. This calculated weakness was a lure, designed to draw the overwhelming Maratha cavalry into terrain that would impede their movement, or, at the very least, prevent them from easily enveloping his entire force. It was a terrifying acknowledgement that he could not fight the Marathas everywhere at once. He chose to accept enormous risk on his flank to ensure that his center, the core of his meager British infantry, could deliver a decisive punch. As his troops snapped into this perilously thin formation, they were still under pressure. The Maratha artillery, though displaced, was now being brought forward, and their French-trained infantry was advancing with disciplined menace. Wellesley's objective was no longer to win a conventional battle, it was to use the shock of his presence, the terror of his audacity, and the speed of his disciplined deployment to negate the Marathas' numerical advantage. He was betting that the sheer discipline of his 2-rank line, the ability of every man to load and fire in unison, remaining steady against the sight of tens of thousands bearing down on them, would be enough to hold the fragile formation intact. The deployment itself was a demonstration of the incredible training forged during the deadly pursuit. While the Marathas were clumsily repositioning their artillery and struggling with the logistics of their complex wheeling maneuver, the British and Sepoy forces executed their deployment with speed and precision, a mechanical efficiency that was the only counter to the enemy's crushing mass. The officers knew, and the men knew, that the next few minutes would be the most demanding of their lives. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a long, thin, scarlet and black thread stretched across the plain, facing an ocean of humanity. This deployment was not strategy, it was a desperate plea for salvation, executed against every written rule of war. The initial phase of the battle began not with a grand charge, but with a terrifying, agonizing advance. Wellesley's impossibly thin, 2-rank line began to move forward across the open ground, directly toward the massed, repositioning Maratha infantry and the rapidly resighted artillery. This was the moment where everything, the speed, the audacity, the entire strategic gamble, came down to the discipline of the individual soldier. As the British and Allied forces marched, the Maratha infantry, highly disciplined under their French commanders, began their deliberate advance. They presented a solid wall of manpower, marching with confidence against a force they knew they outnumbered overwhelmingly. The sheer scale of the Maratha numbers was designed to induce panic and rupture. The crucial psychological moment arrived when the two infantry lines drew within effective firing range. The Marathas, confident in their numerical superiority, fired their opening volleys. This was met by the sound of death, the precise, synchronized thunder of the British and Sepoy countervolley. The defining narrative of this clash is not the firepower, but the steadiness. The British 74th and 78th Highlanders and the vital Sepoy battalions of the Madras Native Infantry, troops often dismissed by the European establishment, stood firm. They maintained their rigid, mechanical discipline under fire that would have shattered less well-trained troops. In a two-rank line, every casualty was immediately felt, and every gap was a potential point of catastrophic collapse. Yet, as men fell, the lines did not waver. They were taught to instantly close ranks, ensuring the continuous integrity of the formation. This discipline was the result of Wellesley's constant, grueling training during the deadly pursuit. He had drilled into them the necessity of firing by ranks with cold, precise efficiency, ensuring that the volley fire was devastatingly concentrated and sustained. Against the tide of Maratha mass, the thin British line delivered a quality of fire that was simply superior. While the Maratha volleys were wide and numerous, the British and Sepoy volleys were narrow, focused, and lethal, tearing massive holes in the advancing enemy ranks. The psychological effect of this unshakable discipline was profound. The Maratha infantry expected the small British force to buckle, to retreat, or to become disordered by their sheer mass and the overwhelming artillery. Instead, they faced a line that seemed to be made of iron. The Sepoy soldiers, fighting under British colours, demonstrated a loyalty and steadiness that was the foundation of Wellesley's genius. He treated them as professionals, and they responded by delivering professional performance under fire. This initial, brutal infantry slugfest continued for a horrifying period. The Maratha line was immense, and despite the effective volleys, their sheer weight kept pushing forward. The fighting devolved into a chaotic, close-quarters slugging match where officers ran between the ranks, desperately shouting commands over the din of musketry and screaming shells. But the line held. The discipline of the Sepoy and the Redcoat proved to be the single, most effective counter to the Marathas' numerical supremacy. The enemy's confidence, built on their massive advantage, began to erode as their ranks were decimated by an enemy that simply refused to break. Wellesley had traded quantity for unbreakable quality, and the Marathas were about to pay the ultimate price for underestimating the cohesion of the enemy they had cornered. The foundation of the Maratha collapse was laid not in a grand charge, but in the stubborn refusal of a thin, exhausted line of infantry to yield a single inch. As the infantry lines locked into their grinding, deadly exchange, the battle was still precariously balanced. Wellesley's flanks remained his most vulnerable point, particularly the right flank, where the Maratha forces were immense and their cavalry, thousands of professional horsemen, were waiting for the slightest disorder to launch their decisive, annihilating charge. The cavalry arm of Wellesley's command, primarily the 19th Light Dragoons and a few thousand Allied light cavalry, was commanded by Colonel Patrick Maxwell. Maxwell was a brave, aggressive officer, and Wellesley had given him strict orders: hold the flank, observe, and wait for the enemy's main infantry line to show signs of faltering before launching a disciplined, penetrating attack to roll up the Maratha flank. The priority was cohesion and timing. However, in the chaos and deafening noise of the battle, Maxwell made a fatal, impulsive error, an error rooted in courage, but one that almost destroyed Wellesley's entire plan. Seeing the pressure on the exhausted 74th Highlanders, who were taking devastating punishment from concentrated fire, Maxwell believed the moment had arrived. He launched his cavalry charge too early and too wide. Instead of waiting for the Maratha infantry to fully commit to the main fight, Maxwell led his horsemen in a sweeping, unauthorized maneuver designed to envelop the Maratha left flank near the village of Assaye, pushing deeper than intended. The initial impact was tremendous. The shock of the British cavalry charge, combined with the momentum of the Allied horsemen, tore into the exposed Maratha infantry and dislocated their reserves, which were still trying to execute the clumsy wheeling maneuver forced by Wellesley's earlier ford crossing. The cavalry proved that, even in small numbers, their disciplined shock action could disrupt the enemy's vast formations. For a brief, exhilarating moment, it appeared Maxwell's audacious charge might secure the right flank and lead to a swift routing of the enemy. But the Maratha High Command was not inactive. Recognizing the cavalry's overextension, they immediately launched their own, massive countercharge. The thousands of professional Maratha heavy cavalry, who had been waiting for their moment, swept in from the wings, aiming to envelop and crush the isolated British horsemen. The ensuing melee was one of the most brutal of the day. Maxwell's small force was instantly swamped by an overwhelming tide of horse and steel. The British cavalry fought with ferocious desperation, but they were vastly outnumbered and caught in a classic pincer movement. In the height of the chaotic battle, Colonel Patrick Maxwell was killed. He fell leading his charge, cut down by the sheer weight of the Maratha numbers. His death immediately injected confusion and near panic into the Allied cavalry forces, who now began to waver, leaderless and surrounded. Maxwell's fatal error, the premature charge, cost him his life and risked the entire battle. It momentarily disorganized the British flank and forced Wellesley, who was focused on the infantry center, to divert critical attention and resources to prevent a complete collapse of his right wing. Wellesley had gambled on the discipline of his infantry, and they had delivered. But he had also relied on the measured restraint of his cavalry commander, and that restraint had failed. The charge was a spectacular tactical success in terms of disruption, but a near disaster in terms of execution and timing. It highlighted the impossible risks inherent in fighting such an overwhelming force, reminding Wellesley that every subordinate decision, even one made with the best intent, could lead to catastrophe. The price of the necessary disruption on the right flank was high, paid for in blood and the life of a brave officer, yet the sacrifice ultimately bought the crucial time the main infantry line desperately needed to complete their task. The early stages of the infantry clash and the disruptive cavalry charge by Maxwell had given Wellesley a temporary advantage, causing disarray in the Maratha front line. But the battle was far from won. The Maratha army, being the sophisticated military machine that it was, had deep reserves, and as Wellesley's tiny force began to suffer grievously from casualties and exhaustion, the true, terrifying resilience of the enemy manifested. This was the darkest moment of Assaye, the time when the entire British and Sepoy force was pushed to the absolute breaking point. As the Maratha frontline infantry began to fall back under the relentless, disciplined volleys of the British, their commanders played their trump card: the second line rises. A fresh, large body of French-trained Maratha infantry, which had been concealed behind the first line, suddenly advanced. These were not panicked men. These were rested, disciplined reserves, surging forward to exploit the widening gaps in the shattered, exhausted British line. Crucially, the Marathas had feigned the destruction of their artillery. As the British and Sepoy lines advanced over the ground abandoned by the first wave, they discovered that many of the heavy guns had not been disabled but merely spiked and temporarily abandoned. Maratha gunners, who had expertly concealed themselves among the dead and wounded, suddenly sprang up. In a lightning-fast countermove, they cleared the spikes, reloaded the cannons, and unleashed a fresh, devastating barrage of grape shot and canister fire directly into the advancing, exposed British ranks. This combination, fresh infantry attacking through a massive gap, coupled with the reactivated artillery firing at point-blank range, was almost fatal. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The small, thin British line, already operating at a 40% casualty rate in some regiments, began to buckle. The 74th Highlanders, having borne the brunt of the fire and the earliest attacks, were particularly vulnerable. They were caught between the crushing weight of the fresh infantry attack from the front and the sudden, devastating return of the artillery fire from their supposed rear. The Highlanders' formations shattered, they were nearly surrounded and facing annihilation. It seemed the inevitable had arrived, the iron line was broken. Panic began to spread. Troops began to hesitate, unsure where the enemy was coming from or which fire to prioritize. This was the moment the Maratha cavalry, those 20,000 professional horsemen, were waiting for. They began to tighten their circle, anticipating the complete rupture and the opportunity to charge in and turn the retreat into a slaughter. Seeing the catastrophic risk, Arthur Wellesley was forced to take command of the fight personally. He could not rely on his reserves, because he had none. He had to plug the gap with his presence and his will alone. He rode into the thickest of the fire, desperately rallying the wavering 74th and ordering his only remaining reserves, a handful of Madras cavalry and the 78th Highlanders, to shift position and counter the revived artillery fire. He was seen galloping across the field, barking commands, his distinctive presence acting as a focus of discipline amid the chaos. He risked his life repeatedly, a commander knowing that if he fell, the entire army would disintegrate instantly. The climax of this counterattack was a desperate, chaotic infantry brawl. It was no longer a battle of maneuver or volley fire. It was a confused struggle for survival, fought hand-to-hand amidst the roar of revived cannons. The Sepoy battalions fought with furious determination to hold the flanks, knowing that a single collapse meant the end. Wellesley's intervention, combined with the phenomenal courage of the few remaining regiments, ultimately stabilized the line. The 78th Highlanders were redirected to attack and disable the revived artillery position in a desperate infantry charge, buying the 74th enough time to pull back and reform. The British had survived the Marathas' brilliant counterpunch, but only just. They were exhausted, badly mauled, and surrounded by their own dead and the enemy's resurrected fire. They had survived the impossible, but the cost had nearly been total. The Maratha counterattack, fueled by fresh troops and the resurrected artillery, brought the entire British force to the brink of collapse. It was a moment of supreme, chaotic violence, and the ultimate threat to the campaign was not the loss of 1,000 men, but the loss of a single man, Colonel Arthur Wellesley. The rule of command, particularly in that era, dictated that a general observe the battle from a safe distance, commanding through aides and messengers. But in the crisis of the second line rising, Wellesley knew that the only way to prevent a rout was to personally inject his will and his presence into the point of maximum danger. He rode directly into the shattered ranks of the 74th Highlanders and the furious exchange of fire around the recaptured Maratha guns. It was a reckless, magnificent act of leadership, and it nearly cost him the battle, his life, and the future of the British Empire. As Wellesley galloped across the blood-soaked field, issuing rapid, desperate orders to rally the wavering troops and redirect the 78th Highlanders toward the functioning cannon, he became an unmistakable, prominent target. He was the focus of the battle, the only man preventing the discipline from disintegrating into panic. Then, the inevitable happened. A cannonball or heavy musket shot slammed into the ground beneath him, or perhaps struck the horse directly. The animal went down instantly, violently, throwing Wellesley to the ground amidst the dead and the desperate fighting. This moment, a horse shot from under him, was the single most critical near-miss of the day. If Wellesley had been killed or incapacitated, the entire British effort would have ceased. Command would have instantly devolved into confusion. The various regimental commanders, already stretched to their limits, would have lacked the singular, guiding authority to execute the desperate, complex countermaneuvers required to survive the Maratha counterattack. Without Wellesley's iron presence, the shattered 74th would have been enveloped, the 78th's charge would have stalled, and the Maratha cavalry would have charged home, turning the fragile British line into a final, bloody ruin. For a terrifying, brief instant, the troops who saw their commander fall must have felt a wave of icy despair. The loss of a general often meant the immediate, total defeat of the army. However, fortune, or the sheer grit of his personal staff, intervened. Wellesley, bruised and stunned, was quickly remounted by his aides. The entire episode lasted only moments, but it was enough to impress upon every soldier the incredible peril of their situation and the non-negotiable commitment of their commander. He was back on a fresh horse, his uniform covered in dust and sweat, still directing the fight as if nothing had happened, his composure absolute. This near-death experience, far from breaking the spirit of the troops, had the opposite effect. It acted as a brutal catalyst for cohesion. Seeing the general himself narrowly escape death, risking everything just to keep the line intact, re-galvanized the men. They were fighting not just for the empire, but for the man who was leading them from the front, defying the rules of command and the laws of probability. Wellesley's composure following this incident was a perfect illustration of his emerging Iron Duke character. He absorbed the shock, assessed the continuing danger, and maintained the cold, analytical mindset required to command. The commander in peril had survived, and with him, so did the last, desperate hope of the army. He rode straight back to the critical zone, securing the final deployment of his few reserves and driving home the attack against the revived artillery positions. The price was almost his life, but by surviving the fall, Wellesley averted the final catastrophe and ensured that the desperate courage of his exhausted troops would not be wasted. The battle could, and would, continue. The Maratha counterattack had been repulsed by sheer will and Wellesley's near-fatal personal intervention, but the British line was shattered, exhausted, and running low on ammunition. The battle could not continue as a firing exchange. The small, depleted force could not sustain the losses. This moment demanded a final, overwhelming act of brutal aggression, a move to end the fighting instantly. This was the moment of the bayonet. Wellesley, assessing the desperate situation, issued the final, chilling command: charge them with the bayonet. No firing until the steel is in their ranks. The remaining British and Sepoy infantry, particularly the 78th Highlanders and the Corps Sepoy units, fixed bayonets onto their muskets. They let out a ragged, desperate cheer, and launched themselves into a final, chaotic sprint toward the massed, disciplined ranks of the Maratha second line. This was the terrifying, silent final act of the infantry engagement, where the discipline of the volley gave way to the ferocious, primitive courage of hand-to-hand combat. The psychological effect of the bayonet charge, particularly on the Maratha infantry, was instantaneous and decisive. The Marathas, though French-trained and fighting bravely, were accustomed to the orderly exchange of volley fire. They understood the rules of the musket battle. They had expected the British, having survived the artillery and the counterattack, to maintain the firing line, gradually wearing themselves down. What they did not expect was an enemy, vastly outnumbered and nearing exhaustion, to suddenly abandon their most lethal weapon, the firearm, and rush forward with cold steel. The discipline of the line was being traded for the shock of the assault. The bayonet charge, when executed correctly, is the ultimate instrument of psychological rupture. As the thin, screaming British and Sepoy lines slammed into the Maratha formations, the fighting devolved into a chaotic, ferocious melee. The momentum of the charge, combined with the sheer terror induced by the prospect of close-quarters steel, began to break the Maratha cohesion. The Maratha ranks, though deep, could not withstand the focused, disciplined violence of the close-quarters fighting. Their professional infantry had stood firm against musket balls, but they lacked the specific cultural and tactical conditioning for this kind of ruthless, sustained hand-to-hand combat. Their formations, which had been so formidable, began to crack at the seams. This was the moment the Maratha confidence was shattered. They realized they were not fighting merely an army. They were fighting a force of singular, terrifying will that refused to accept defeat even when facing total destruction. The sheer audacity of the charge, combined with the knowledge that the British commander was still alive and directing the fight despite being thrown from his horse, broke their spirit. As the bayonets drove home, the Maratha second line began to disintegrate. Formations dissolved into panicked retreat. The disciplined infantry, the backbone of the French-trained force, turned and fled, abandoning their weapons and leaving their heavy, unmovable artillery pieces behind. The flight of the infantry, the elite of the army, signaled the end of the Maratha will to fight. The sheer mass of the remaining Maratha forces began to collapse upon itself. The vast body of Maratha cavalry, seeing their infantry reserves break and flee, made no attempt to intervene decisively. They had waited for the opportune moment of rupture, but instead of finding a panicked retreat, they found an enemy advancing with bayonets, seemingly indifferent to the odds. The cavalry, renowned for harassment and pursuit, proved unwilling to engage a focused, disciplined infantry force in a chaotic, hand-to-hand melee. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the fighting, which had raged for only a few hours, was essentially over. The Maratha army, which had begun the day as the greatest indigenous military power in India, was in full, irreversible rout. They had succumbed not just to disciplined fire, but to the psychological warfare embodied in Wellesley's audacity and the cold steel of the final, desperate bayonet charge. The impossible had been achieved. Wellesley had broken the entire Maratha army with a force that should have been annihilated before noon. The moment the Maratha infantry broke and fled, the fighting transitioned instantly from a clash of organized lines to a gruesome, ruthless pursuit. This was the brutal, messy aftermath where the rules of disciplined warfare gave way to the primal urge for vengeance and exhaustion. This was not a moment for mercy. This was the horrors of the pursuit. Wellesley, seeing the enemy's will completely shattered, immediately unleashed his cavalry, the remaining 19th Light Dragoons and allied horsemen, into the open plain. Their objective was simple: turn the Maratha retreat into a full-scale rout and maximize the destruction of the enemy forces so they could not quickly reform or rally. The Maratha cavalry, which had stood aloof during the main infantry engagement, now proved useless to their fleeing comrades. Instead of covering the retreat, they too joined the panicked flight, abandoning their own infantry to the mercy of the pursuing British horse. The pursuit was less a military operation and more a slaughter. The exhausted British and Sepoy troops, having fought for hours under overwhelming fire and having witnessed the near destruction of their ranks, were merciless. The psychological tension of the impossible odds snapped, replaced by a cold, desperate ferocity. The Maratha infantry, encumbered by their uniforms, training, and equipment, were slow-moving targets. The British and Allied cavalry rode them down relentlessly. This was no quarter given. Men who had fought bravely were cut down as they fled. The sheer number of Maratha casualties, estimates run into the thousands killed and wounded, was incurred primarily during this savage pursuit, not during the main battle. A particular focus of the brutality was the Maratha artillery positions. The gunners, many of them European mercenaries or highly skilled local technicians, were targets of intense fury. They had inflicted the most damage on the British forces, and the Redcoats and Sepoys sought them out for retribution. These men were rarely offered quarter. The British infantry advanced over the fields, systematically clearing the artillery parks and ensuring the Marathas' heavy cannon, their greatest asset, were spiked, captured, or utterly destroyed, ensuring they could not be used again. The fields around Assaye quickly became a nightmare landscape of carnage. The sheer density of the fighting meant the bodies lay in heaps. The cries of the wounded, both British and Maratha, mixed with the shouting of the pursuing horsemen and the sporadic, final discharges of musketry. The immense Maratha baggage train, containing not just supplies but vast amounts of loot and personal effects, was captured, further demoralizing the fleeing forces. For Wellesley's exhausted troops, the pursuit was a final, grueling expenditure of energy. They were forced to maintain their discipline even in the face of such chaos, not only to secure the victory but to ensure they were not ambushed by pockets of desperate Maratha resistance. The immediate aftermath was sobering. The victory was absolute, but the cost was horrific. As the pursuit finally slowed, the surviving British and Sepoy troops gathered on the field, surveying the scene. The cost to Wellesley's force was staggering. Nearly one-third of his entire column, around 1,580 men out of 7,000, lay dead or wounded. Some regiments, like the 74th Highlanders, suffered casualties approaching 60% of their fighting strength. Wellesley later remarked that he had never seen so many dead men on a field of battle. The sheer bloodletting confirmed the impossible nature of the task. The Marathas, however, had suffered a far greater catastrophe, a loss of 6,000 to 12,000 men, and, crucially, the total destruction of their French-trained infantry and heavy artillery arm. The horrors of the pursuit secured the win, making the defeat of the Maratha military machine total and irreversible for the moment. But the victory was baptized in a truly terrible amount of blood, a testament to the fact that fighting against such impossible odds demands a price that transcends mere casualties, a price paid in discipline, exhaustion, and brutal, necessary savagery. The cheers of the British and Sepoy troops that followed the rout quickly faded, replaced by the profound, exhausted silence that descends upon any battlefield immediately after the fighting stops. This was the moment of reckoning, where the glory of the impossible victory gave way to the silent toll, the terrible price paid for survival. As dusk began to settle over the plains of Assaye, Arthur Wellesley rode slowly across the ground his men had just conquered. What he surveyed was not a field of triumph, but a vast, sprawling graveyard. He had gambled everything and won, but the cost was a staggering, sobering testament to the impossible odds he had overcome. The immediate casualty reports began to filter in, revealing the terrifying nature of the day. Of the roughly 7,000 troops Wellesley had led across the Kaitna River, approximately 1,580 were dead or wounded. This figure represented a horrifying loss rate of nearly 25% for the entire column. But the true horror lay in the specific units that bore the brunt of the fighting. The British regiments, the elite 74th and 78th Highlanders, were decimated. The 74th, which had been caught in the crossfire during the Maratha counterattack, suffered losses of over 60% of its engaged strength. The two British regiments together lost nearly 500 men. These were not replaceable losses, they were the core of the professional fighting force. The Sepoy battalions, the Madras native infantry units, which had demonstrated extraordinary discipline and fought shoulder to shoulder with the Redcoats, also suffered devastating losses. Their sacrifice was instrumental, proving the fundamental flaw in the Maratha assumption that the Allied troops would break first. Their devotion to holding the impossibly thin line was literally the reason the army survived. Wellesley famously remarked later that he never was in so hot a fire as I was for 10 minutes, which I think elapsed from the moment the troops advanced to the attack to the moment the enemy fled. The severity of the casualties was proof of that intense, concentrated 10 minutes of artillery hell and close-quarters combat. The victory, therefore, was undeniably Pyrrhic. Wellesley had destroyed the enemy army, but he had done so by grievously wounding his own. The immediate strategic consequence was that his remaining force was too depleted to immediately pursue the retreating Maratha chiefs, Scindia and Bonsall, allowing them a critical window to escape and reorganize. The aftermath was a scene of frantic, grim necessity. The surviving troops, utterly exhausted, were immediately set to the harrowing task of clearing the field. The priority was retrieving the wounded, both British and Sepoy, and attempting to administer what little aid was available. The sheer volume of casualties overwhelmed the meager medical staff and resources. The field hospitals quickly became scenes of desperate triage. This silent toll served as a chilling reminder to Wellesley and to history that success against impossible odds is rarely clean. The victory was a triumph of will and discipline over mass and firepower, but it was purchased at the highest price. Every surviving man carried the deep psychological scar of having seen his comrades obliterated by grapeshot and having fought hand-to-hand against overwhelming numbers. The cost was immediate, tangible, and devastating. It ensured that while Assaye secured Britain's position in India, it would be remembered by those who fought it not as a glorious triumph, but as a day of unparalleled, bloody sacrifice, a victory only narrowly pulled back from the jaws of total, annihilating defeat. The blood shed on the plains of Assaye was the literal foundation of the British Empire's century of dominance in India. In the immediate aftermath of Assaye, the triumph that Arthur Wellesley had secured with blood and audacity was met not with universal acclaim, but with a firestorm of controversy. For the established military and political elite, the victory was too close, the casualties too high, and the methods too unconventional. Instead of a hero's welcome, Wellesley faced accusations that could have led to his ruin and a court-martial. The core of the criticism was devastatingly simple: Wellesley was deemed too rash. The military establishment in India and London, rooted in the cautious, doctrine-heavy European school of warfare, viewed Assaye through the lens of cold mathematics, not strategic success. They focused not on the fact that he won, but on the terrifying risk he took. Their primary argument was that a commander's first duty is to preserve his army. By engaging a force 5 times his size, crossing a river, and deploying in a 2-rank line without awaiting reinforcements, Colonel Stevenson's slower column, Wellesley had knowingly violated this fundamental principle. Critics argued that the victory was secured by luck and Maratha incompetence in repositioning their artillery, not by sound generalship. They pointed to the staggering casualty rate, nearly a quarter of his force lost, as proof of his reckless abandon. The whispers began immediately among jealous or conservative officers. Wellesley had risked the entire East India Company project in a single, audacious gamble that easily could have ended in total massacre. This controversy was inextricably linked to nepotism. As the younger brother of the powerful Governor-General, Richard Wellesley, Arthur was already under intense scrutiny. His detractors saw his rapid promotion and command not as merit, but as favoritism. His rash generalship at Assaye provided the perfect ammunition, a chance to humble the Governor-General by attacking his favored sibling. The implied accusation was that only a privileged commander could afford to be so reckless with the lives of his troops and the security of the company. Wellesley had to spend significant time and political capital defending his decision. His defense was based on the strategic reality that his critics simply refused to acknowledge: timing was everything. He argued that any delay, any retreat to wait for Stevenson, would have been interpreted by the Marathas as weakness, allowing them to escape and rally with far greater numbers and better positions. The strategic necessity of compelling the battle outweighed the tactical risk. His decision to attack, he asserted, was not born of recklessness, but of a deep, calculated understanding that inaction would have guaranteed the collapse of the entire campaign. He won the debate, and avoided the court-martial, because the results were undeniable. Despite the cost, the Maratha military machine was broken, their morale shattered, and the French influence crippled. The victory secured the Deccan, which in turn secured the financial flow vital to Britain's struggle against Napoleon. The firestorm of controversy over Assaye had a profound effect on Wellesley. It solidified his reputation among his peers as a cold, calculating risk-taker, but it also reinforced his own belief in his unconventional methods. He learned that results, no matter how costly, were the ultimate defense against criticism. This political trial, coming right after the physical one, was essential in forging the Iron Duke, a commander who relied on his own meticulous planning and was utterly impervious to the opinions of his cautious detractors. He would carry this lesson, the need for ruthless, decisive aggression and contempt for conventional caution, to the battlefields of Portugal and, ultimately, Waterloo. The immediate strategic outcome of Assaye was the preservation of Britain's position in the Deccan. But the long-term impact, the true victory that resonated for a century, was the psychological and tactical legacy, the Assaye effect. This battle fundamentally and permanently altered the way indigenous powers viewed and fought the British in India, transforming their military reputation from cautious invaders into a force of terrifying, unpredictable will. The core of the Assaye effect was the shattering of confidence among the Maratha leadership and, by extension, other principalities across the subcontinent. The Marathas possessed everything that should have guaranteed victory: a numerical advantage of 5-1, a perfect defensive position anchored by a river, and, critically, artillery superiority manned by French experts. Assaye proved that even with every factor in their favor, the European-trained Maratha forces could not break the disciplined British and Sepoy infantry. Their greatest asset, their sophisticated, European-style army, was exposed as brittle when faced with a commander willing to violate every conventional rule of warfare. The failure was not merely tactical, it was existential. The Maratha chiefs, the last great hope for expelling the British, learned a horrific lesson. The British were not just better armed, they were more audacious, faster, and psychologically unbreakable. They would attack when logic dictated retreat, and they would hold when all hope was lost. This realization instantly crippled the will to fight on a large scale. Why mobilize 40,000 men and 100 guns if a tiny, depleted force could still win? The tactical paradigm shift. Assaye did not just win a battle, it created a new tactical template for warfare in India, rooted in Wellesley's go fast, go light heresy. Prioritization of speed, the relentless, forced march that led to the battle became the standard. The campaign demonstrated that mobility was the supreme weapon in the vast Indian theatre. By prioritizing speed over massive supply trains, Wellesley ensured that British forces could always compel an engagement, denying the enemy the time and space needed to maneuver or consolidate. The bayonet and discipline. The bayonet charge at the climax of Assaye cemented the psychological terror of the British infantry. It proved that in the face of overwhelming fire, the disciplined two-rank line could hold, and that the final push of cold steel was the ultimate, terrifying antidote to numerical superiority. This created a lasting myth of British infantry invincibility that preceded every future engagement. Crippling French influence. By destroying the Marathas' core of French-trained infantry and, critically, capturing and destroying their heavy artillery, Wellesley effectively severed the lifeline of modern military influence that Napoleon was trying to foster in India. This victory was a direct blow to Bonaparte's global strategy, crippling the Marathas' ability to wage modern war for years to come. Terrified enemies. In the years following Assaye, the reputation of Wellesley's troops became a terrifying strategic asset in itself. Indigenous rulers, terrified by the staggering losses at Assaye and the speed with which Wellesley was able to force the decisive fight, became far more cautious. They recognized the pattern: Wellesley would not wait, and he would not run. The Assaye effect meant that in future campaigns, the mere presence of British and Sepoy forces, even in small numbers, often prompted local rulers to surrender or avoid battle entirely. The field of Assaye thus became a silent weapon, a memory of mass destruction that deterred future coalitions. The battle secured the military reputation that would allow the East India Company to consolidate its power, realizing the ultimate prize of Hindustan. The financial stability derived from this security would, in turn, provide the gold that financed the war against Napoleon in Europe, allowing Britain to fight the French for another decade until the final victory at Waterloo. Assaye was, therefore, the true forging ground of British India and the crucial, forgotten pivot point of the global war against Napoleon. The final, profound significance of the Battle of Assaye lies not in the dust of the Deccan, but in the future fields of Europe. This battle, more than any other in his early career, was the crucible that forged Colonel Arthur Wellesley into the Iron Duke, the commander who would ultimately defeat Napoleon at Waterloo. Assaye was, in every meaningful sense, the dress rehearsal for the great European struggle. It was where Wellesley learned how to defeat a French-style army against impossible odds. Assaye was his first Napoleon. Wellesley's triumph over the Maratha Confederacy, a proxy force for French strategy, gave him an unparalleled psychological edge and a deep tactical education that no other British general of his generation possessed. While his peers were learning cautious maneuvers and minor actions in Europe, Wellesley was facing a large, professional, French-trained army, operating with devastating artillery superiority and overwhelming cavalry mass. He learned to defeat the French system, the deep formations, the heavy guns, the sudden, aggressive infantry counterpunch, long before he ever saw Napoleon's Imperial Guard. The key lessons learned at Assaye were directly transferable to the Peninsular War and Waterloo. First and foremost was the mastery of logistics. The successful forced march to Assaye taught him that an army's true strength lies not in its fighting men, but in its ability to be reliably fed and moved. This fanatical attention to supply and administration became Wellesley's hallmark in Portugal and Spain. It allowed him to maneuver faster and sustain his armies longer than the French marshals, who were notorious for living off the land, thereby alienating local populations. At Assaye, he learned that superior logistics could defeat superior numbers. Secondly, the battle proved the effectiveness of the two-rank line against massed, French-style attacks. The Maratha infantry, disciplined but unable to withstand the focused, sustained fire of the thin British and Sepoy line, cracked under pressure. Wellesley carried this tactical innovation directly to Europe, famously utilizing the thin line and the concentrated volley fire to withstand the French columns in Spain and Portugal. At Waterloo, the steadfast line of British infantry holding firm against the colossal French assaults was the direct legacy of the iron discipline displayed by the 74th Highlanders and the Sepoys at Assaye. Thirdly, Assaye taught Wellesley the essential value of personal, decisive action and imperturbable composure in a crisis. The moment his horse was shot from under him and he was back in the saddle within seconds, directing the battle amid chaos, cemented his understanding that a commander's sheer presence is a force multiplier. This cold, almost mechanical calmness became the legendary characteristic of Wellington at Waterloo, where his unwavering demeanor steadied his troops through the final, desperate French assaults. He learned in India that the only way to beat a vast enemy is to show them a will that is absolutely unbreakable. Furthermore, the firestorm of controversy that followed Assaye, where he was criticized for being too rash, immunized him against conservative military opinion. He gained the confidence to disregard conventional doctrine when strategy demanded it. This allowed him to execute the brilliant, unconventional defensive campaigns in the Peninsular War, refusing to fight where the French wanted and always compelling the fight on his own chosen terms, a strategic mirror of his decision to cross the Kaitna at the unseen ford. Assaye was not merely a victory, it was a grueling, practical examination in independent command, logistics, unconventional tactics, and leadership under pressure. It was the training ground that refined his character from the politically connected Colonel Arthur Wellesley into the self-possessed, unyielding Duke of Wellington. When he finally faced Napoleon on the fields of Waterloo 12 years later, he did so with the quiet, chilling confidence of a man who had already defeated a Napoleonic-style enemy against far greater odds, and who knew, with absolute certainty, the limits of the human will under fire. The fate of Europe, and the destiny of the man who saved it, were truly decided on that dusty, forgotten plain in India. The sun set on the plains of Assaye that September day in 1803, bathing the silent, blood-soaked ground in a haunting orange glow. It marked the end of a battle, but the dawn of a new strategic reality. The victory achieved by Colonel Arthur Wellesley was more than just a momentary triumph. It was a foundational moment, a victory whose enduring legacy secured an empire, shaped a great commander, and changed war forever. The immediate, most tangible legacy of Assaye was the securing of British India. By crushing the Maratha forces, Wellesley eliminated the last, best hope of organized, large-scale indigenous resistance armed with modern European technology. The Confederacy was broken, its elite military corps annihilated, and its morale shattered. While the war dragged on, the decisive blow had been struck. The flow of wealth and resources from the subcontinent was secured, providing the essential, endless financial lifeline that enabled Britain to continue funding the massive coalitions against Napoleon Bonaparte for the next decade. Without the gold secured by the Sepoys and Redcoats at Assaye, it is entirely possible that Pitt the Younger could not have sustained the fight, potentially altering the entire course of the Napoleonic Wars in France's favor. Assaye was the invisible financial victory that set the stage for Trafalgar and Waterloo. However, the enduring legacy goes far beyond geopolitics. It is enshrined in the myth of the British soldier and the birth of the Iron Duke. Assaye created an immediate and lasting reputation for the British and Allied Sepoy forces. The terrifying spectacle of a small, thin line of infantry refusing to break, enduring an overwhelming cannonade, and advancing into a 5-to-1 advantage with bayonets, became a military legend. It established a psychological advantage that British armies would exploit for a century. Future opponents in India and elsewhere would often pause, knowing they faced a force that was psychologically conditioned to win against impossible odds, a terrifying reputation forged in the blood of the 74th Highlanders and the steadfastness of the Madras native infantry. The victory cemented the absolute reliability of the Sepoy units under extreme pressure, proving Wellesley's faith in his allied troops and laying the foundation for the massive, loyal Indian army of the future. For Arthur Wellesley himself, Assaye was his true initiation. All the quiet lessons of logistics, speed, and audacity, the Suicidal Doctrine, were validated in the most brutal proving ground possible. He learned that the ultimate counter to a vast, well-equipped enemy is not caution, but cold, calculated aggression and absolute composure. He developed the contempt for conventional doctrine and the imperviousness to criticism that would define his later career. The man who nearly died when his horse was shot from under him emerged with an icy confidence, knowing he had survived the worst fire the world could throw at him. He carried this steely, unshakable demeanor directly to the Peninsular War, where he consistently outmaneuvered and defeated Napoleon's marshals, and ultimately to Waterloo, where his unyielding resolve saved the day. The Iron Duke was not born in Europe, he was forged in the heat and chaos of the Deccan. Yet, despite its monumental impact, Assaye remains a forgotten genius in the annals of history. It is overshadowed by the grandeur of Waterloo, an understandable consequence of the man himself, Wellesley, ever meticulous, never sought glory for its own sake. He wrote about the battle with dry, professional detachment, ensuring it lacked the epic, self-promotional narrative that often secures a battle's place in popular memory. The immense casualties also ensured that for those who fought it, it was remembered with solemn, grim sobriety, not celebratory fanfare. In conclusion, the Battle of Assaye was the linchpin of the British Empire's rise. It was the moment where a small, financially driven trading power secured the wealth to sustain a global war against the most powerful